Self-awareness is one of the best tools that you can have when it comes to understanding yourself and maximizing the relationships that you have in your life. So how do we practice self-awareness? Well, we're going to be talking all about that in today's episode of Real Talk. Let's go. Welcome back, everybody, to Real Talk with Kane Adams. We are on our final episode of self-awareness. We've been going through a series on self-awareness. We've done 3 episodes so far. The first episode on internal self-awareness, which is all about your thoughts, habits, and behaviors and where those thoughts, habits, and behaviors come from, about understanding yourself, why you are the way that you are, why you think the way that you think. So that was episode 1. Second episode, we talked about external self-awareness, which is understanding yourself from somebody else's perspective, understanding the impact that your behaviors have on your relationships around you and on other people. So that was external self-awareness. And then last week's episode, the third episode, we talked about self-consciousness, which is a state of thinking that is like an autopilot state of thinking. It's rooted in shame and fear and wants to keep you in comfort and safety at your detriment, whereas self-awareness wants to push you and nudge you out of that comfort and safety in order to grow in life. And so now we've come to the final episode of our self-awareness series, where we are going to be talking about feedback and how do we be self-aware. And what are some practical tips to become self-aware? And we're going to focus mainly on feedback. And so I'm really excited. And so if you've missed some of the other episodes, take a look. They're on YouTube, on Spotify, or whatever you use to watch or read or listen to this podcast. Episode 1, 2, and 3. This is the final episode, episode 4, as we talk about practical ways of practicing self-awareness. Great. Okay, so when it comes to practicing self-awareness, the first thing that we need to do is to understand that we need it. So you cannot practice self-awareness unless you understand that you need self-awareness. And I think this is a big one, because there will be a lot of people who don't think that they need it, or they think that they're self-aware enough about, they know themselves enough that they don't need to practice it. But self-awareness is something that every single one of us needs to practice. In fact, I'm sure there'll be people who have listened to this series, and even through the series, they've been thinking to themselves about other people who need to practice self-awareness. Or you might be thinking, yeah, this will be great for this person, or I should send this to that person. But we're not talking about other people in this instance. We're talking about you. You are the one that needs to practice self-awareness, because we all need to practice self-awareness. So that's the first key when it comes to practicing self-awareness, and to develop it in our lives, is to admit and recognize that we need it. So when it comes to developing self-awareness, I like to break things down into 3 important virtues that we need to have and we need to practice, or we need to possess in our lives, that'll get us started with the journey of self-awareness. And these 3 virtues are humility, vulnerability, and honesty. Humility, vulnerability, and honesty. So let's go through them each one by one. Humility. So to admit that you need to be self-aware means that you need to submit to humility, because self-awareness is all about learning, and you can't learn unless you are willing to learn, and you won't be willing to learn unless you understand that you need to learn, and you won't understand that you need to learn unless you are willing to be humble. So humility is absolutely the first key, and such a crucial step when it comes to developing self-awareness. You have to know that you need it. You have to know that you need to be self-aware. And to do that requires humility. I suppose something to be mindful of when it comes to self-awareness is to understand that you never fully arrive when it comes to self-awareness. That self-awareness is something that you develop over the course of your life. It's a lifelong commitment. It's something that you've got to be practicing every day, all the time. Because what will happen is that you will practice self-awareness, and you'll begin to understand why you think the way that you think, why you are the way that you are, where those thoughts, habits, and behaviors have come from, and then you'll begin to understand the impact that your behavior is having on other people, and you'll be on a pretty good road. And then it won't be long, believe me, it won't be long before someone will say something will happen, and you will react in a certain autopilot kind of way, and you'll surprise yourself, and you'll think, whoa, where did that come from? And all of a sudden, straight away, you're back onto the journey of self-awareness. Happens all the time. And so you're not going to arrive like 100, you're never going to be 100% self-aware. It's not possible. Because why is that? Because you change. Because we change in life, right? As we grow older, our personalities slowly develop and slowly adapt and slowly change, and our behaviors can change, and even our interests can change. So we're constantly changing as human beings and as people. And which means we're constantly learning about ourselves, about where we're changing, how we're changing, why we're changing, which means that self-awareness is something that we have to practice all the time. And it's something that it's a lifelong commitment that you're always going to be practicing. So you never fully arrive. Now, not only does self-awareness require humility, but self-awareness also requires the second virtue, vulnerability. Okay, so you need humility and you need vulnerability. What do I mean by that? Well, if you want to receive feedback, which we're going to be talking about later on in the episode, you've got to be open to receive it. So you're humble, but you've got to be willing to open yourself up to hear some truths that you don't necessarily want to hear. You've got to be willing to confront your issues, to confront your behavior, to confront your thought patterns, to confront your blind spots like we talked about with external self-awareness. And to do that requires you to be, in a way, unguarded. And being unguarded is something that self-consciousness cannot handle. Because remember, the self-consciousness in our lives wants to keep us in safety and wants to keep us in comfort and wants to keep us in the prison of fear and shame, right? And in order to do that, we need to be as closed off as possible and to not be vulnerable because it's too dangerous, because being vulnerable takes you out of that safety, right? So self-consciousness is an absolute self-awareness killer, like we talked about last episode. And I think a reason for this is because it's rooted in the ego. And we didn't really talk much about the ego last episode. So what I might do is let's touch quickly on the ego, because it's something important that we need to learn and we need to know about, particularly when it comes to self-awareness. The ego plays a massive role, and it's directly tied with self-consciousness. So what is the ego? What do we mean by ego? When we talk about ego, often what we think about is arrogance. So if we say somebody has a big ego, normally we think we're kind of referring to them as being an arrogant person. But ego isn't about arrogance at all. It's not related to arrogance. It can form arrogance, yes, absolutely, but it's not necessarily about arrogance. The job of the ego is, in a way, it's the manager in charge of the self-conscious thoughts and behaviors in your life. So you're self-conscious about what people think about you, worried about how people think about you. Your ego is in charge of keeping all of that in check, but not in a good way. Now, remember how in the first episode we talked about the rose-tinted glasses? So what happens in life is that when we go through life from childhood all the way through to adulthood is that we experience a lot of trauma. We experience situations, rejections, hurt, a lot of trauma, which then become like the rose-tinted glasses that we wear in which we perceive the world and we perceive ourselves through that trauma. We don't realize that we're doing this. It's all subconscious, right? And so what happens is that through the trauma that we experience and through, I guess, what people say about us or to us, is that we form an image and an identity of who we are in our mind that we look through. It's like a lens. But the problem is that lens is often not correct, or it's unhealthy, or it's warped, or it's covered in shame and embarrassment. So we've gone through this experience. We've formed an identity of who we think we are, and then that's self-consciousness, because we become self-conscious of what people think of us and all that kind of stuff. And it's the ego's job to ensure that that identity stays intact. And anything that would come up against that identity, the ego jumps up and says, "That's okay. You stand aside. I'll take care of it." Okay. Classic example would be maybe you think yourself as a nice person. Maybe you've experienced a lot of trauma or whatever in your life, which has caused you, maybe you're an agreeable person who experiences a lot of negative emotion, so you're high in neuroticism, and so therefore you have a proclivity to people please, so you're always pleasing people, and trying to be a nice person as much as you can. And that's the identity that has been created in your mind that the ego is in charge of protecting. So when you go and talk to someone and get some advice or get some feedback, and they may say, "Hey, actually, in this situation here, you actually weren't a very nice person. You inherit, or whatever, by allowing this person to have their way and behave the way that they did, that wasn't actually very nice. And then when you hear things like that, that's when your ego steps in and says, step aside, I'll take care of this, right? And your ego will do anything that it can to protect that and defend you. And that's when you can become very defensive, you become very heated, you become very emotional, charged, volatile, aggressive, because you're feeling under attack, right? And that's what your ego is telling you. That's what your self-consciousness is telling you, is that you're under attack, danger, danger, danger. And so it's your ego's job to defend that. Even if the image that you have in your mind is wrong, this is where it's a bit tricky, right? Is because very often the image that we have of ourselves in our mind is wrong. It's incorrect. It's based on trauma, or it's based on lies or things that people have told us that are not true. But they've solidified in our mind, and all the ego knows to do is that it has to protect it. So, in saying all of that, if that makes sense, is that one of the biggest steps to developing self-awareness is to let go of the ego. And it is one of the hardest things that you will have to do in your life, because it forces you to ask the question, who truly am I? To ask, how do people actually see me? And to do this requires a lot of vulnerability, like we've been talking about. So, and it requires letting go of the ego. It requires opening yourself up and being vulnerable, telling your ego, no, this is not a time anymore to defend this image of myself. It's time to discover who that person really is. And it requires being open to receive confrontation, to receive conflict, to receive truth, to receive honest feedback from people that'll hurt, that'll be uncomfortable to hear, that your self-consciousness and your ego will do anything that they can to stop you from hearing that. But we need to hear it in order to grow. And so to do that takes a lot of guts. To be vulnerable and to be humble and vulnerable takes a lot of bravery and guts to do that, because you're facing confrontation. When you let go of the ego, in a way you become defenseless. But that's the only way that you can obtain self-awareness, is if you let go of the ego and you ask yourself the honest questions so that you can see the truth. Because that's what self-awareness is about. It's about pursuing truth. What is the truth? Why do I think the way that I think? Why am I the way that I am? Why do people see me the way that they see me? What is the truth when it comes to the impact that my behavior is having on other people? And all of that requires vulnerability. So that's vulnerability. And then the last virtue is honesty. So to develop self-awareness requires a commitment to yourself to be as honest as you can during the entire self-awareness process. And this is another, it's kind of, they're all kind of on the same plane, aren't they? Humility, vulnerability, and honesty. But the thing is that you can't be honest with other people unless you're honest with yourself first. In fact, you can't even be honest with God unless you're honest with yourself first. You have to be able to be honest with yourself and to ask yourself the hard questions. And so honesty, like I said, is a commitment. Well, the journey of self-awareness is to make a commitment to be honest with yourself at all times, no matter how much it hurts, so that you can get down to the truth. It's asking yourself questions, like I mentioned before, what's really going on here with the situation? What has caused me to react the way that I did? What is actually happening in this situation, right? Why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling right now? What is it that I could have done that would have caused them to react in a different way that they did? And all of these questions, they require honest answers. And when we answer these questions honestly, that's how we begin to develop self-awareness. All right? So those three virtues there: humility, vulnerability, and honesty. If you have those three things in check, then you're absolutely on your way to a healthy road of self-awareness, which is very exciting. So let's talk about feedback. One of the most effective ways to develop self-awareness is through feedback. What do we mean by feedback? Well, what happens is often the people who are around us, particularly those who are closest to us, can very often, like we talked about with external self-awareness, they can see us for who we are and see things in us that we cannot see ourselves, right? So people around us can see and spot our blind spots that we can't see ourselves. So even though it seems counter-natural or against nature to have to ask people to show us our flaws, again, totally against the self-conscious nature and totally against the ego, is what we need to do if we ever want to grow in life. If we want to find our flaws, we need to be comfortable with asking people to tell us what those flaws are. There's a great quote which I read last week, or could have been the week before, I can't remember, from Paul Scanlon. I think I got it slightly wrong the other week, so this one's the correct one. Forgive me, please. And it's a quote from him, and he says this, and this is the official quote now. If one person says something to you, it's an opinion. If two people say something to you, then it needs attention. If three people say something to you, then it's probably a fact. And that's from Paul Scanlon, who, again, I'll just a disclaimer, a lot of this teaching I have learnt from him. He does a fantastic course on his website about self-awareness, so you can check that out at paulscanlon.com. So if one person says something to you, it's an opinion. If two people say something to you, then it needs attention. If three people say something to you, then it's probably a fact. And we talked about that last week with how if someone says something to you, you don't necessarily need to take the feedback on completely if one person says something. If two people bring up an issue with you, then that's something that you really need to address and take a look at. If three people bring up the same issue to you on separate occasions, then that is a blind spot in your life that's confirmed that you need to address immediately and take stock of your life and to work hard to fix it. Okay, feedback. So, something when it comes to feedback, here's a tip with feedback, okay? So let's say you've gone to someone who you're close to ask them about a situation or whatever, to explain to you about some truths or things that you don't quite see within yourself, and you're giving them the permission to do that. So the first key would be you don't focus on the feedback as a whole. Focus on the nugget of truth that you can find within the feedback. Because what happens is people will give us feedback, and not all of it will be correct. And what happens is, what more than often than not, is that we can be so overcome and overwhelmed by the feedback and in such disagreement with certain parts of the feedback that we end up throwing the whole thing out. And we throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, which is not a good strategy to do, because when you throw everything out, you also throw out the little nuggets that you could have used to be able to help you in life and to help you grow. And so when it comes to feedback, it's about viewing the feedback as a whole that they present to you, and then sifting through, using self-awareness, sifting through what feedback you can use, what feedback is relatable and relevant, and which feedback is not, which feedback is incorrect. And you can only do that if you have a sense of self-awareness already. So when you understand internal self-awareness, who you are, why you are the way that you are, why you think the way that you think, as well as a sense of external self-awareness, so you understand how your behaviors are impacting on other people, and then you ask for feedback. When you receive that feedback, you're able to sift through which feedback is relevant and which one isn't. For example, you might think, oh, okay, this is what they said here. Yeah, I could agree with that maybe. I'll look into that. And then what they said here, yes, that's absolutely correct. Man, I did not see that, and that is something I absolutely need to look at. But then what they said here and what they said here doesn't line up. No, I think I'll disregard that. And so you don't want to focus on the feedback as whole. You want to just take the nuggets of truth, find the nuggets of truth within the feedback that you can apply to your life. On the flip side of that, you know how I said you can throw the baby out with the bathwater. Some people, particularly if you're an agreeable person, could do the opposite and tend to take on all of the feedback that they receive. And again, that's not a good idea either. So if someone shares with you a whole bunch of feedback, you don't have to take every single thing on board and work on it. Otherwise, like we said, some of it could just be opinion, and it's okay to disregard opinion. And so same thing, you sift through and you find which parts are relevant and which parts that you need, the nuggets of truth, I like to call them, and then you find the parts that you can disregard. Another thing about receiving feedback is that you don't need to be, or please don't be intimidated in having to provide an answer straight away. And sometimes we can feel that. Sometimes when people give us feedback, we feel like we need to give them an answer straight away, or give them a defense case straight away, or have to explain yourself straight away. But you don't need to do that. In fact, it's not a good idea to do that, because what happens is Or or you could just pretend that everything's okay and you're accepting it all and it's all fine, which is also what you shouldn't do. I'll explain why. Because someone may give you a piece of feedback and you feel intimidated. And so either one, you will become defensive when they give you feedback and you'll feel like you have to have an answer. So you'll start fumbling your words and you'll start telling them things which you haven't processed yet in your mind. And you start trying to come up with an answer that you haven't even thought about and you're put totally on the spot, and that's not fair. So that's one thing that you could do, which you don't want to do. And the other thing that you could do is just be quiet and accept it as if you are receiving it and comprehending it, and that you have no problems with it, which you don't want to do either. For example, someone may give you a piece of feedback and they ask, what do you think of that? And you might go, yep, that's good. And then they give you another piece of feedback. What do you think? Yep, that's fine. And you keep doing that. They're just going to keep throwing feedback at you to the point where you can't handle it anymore. So you don't want to do either of those. So do not be afraid at all to let the person know who's giving you feedback that you need time to process. So they may give you a piece of feedback and you say, hey, these are some great points that you've brought up. I'm actually going to go away and I'm going to think about them and work out how I can apply these to my life, and then I'll get back to you. Totally fine to say that. And I think it's healthy to say that because you don't want to be overloaded with feedback if you can't handle it. You want to be able to take it piece by piece. So as we become more self-aware with internal self-awareness and external self-awareness, not only do we become better at receiving feedback, but we can also be in a place where we could give feedback quite proficiently and quite well. What do I mean by that? Well, because the more self-aware we become, so if you become internally self-aware, you understand yourself, why you are the way that you are, why you think the way that you think, and your behaviors, thoughts, and habits, etc. And then you also are aware about how your behavior is impacting on other people, then you can start to see the blind spots in other people's lives and what they could do to be able to fix that as well. So, for example, you might have a proclivity, like myself, to people please. So you can find it hard to say no, and so you're always wanting to do things for people, to help people, to please people. And as you are aware of that and you're aware of how that behavior is impacting other people, you can begin to see other people sharing that same behavior, right? Which can give you an insight to kind of how they behave, which could be a good opportunity for you to give them feedback if they're willing to receive it. If you want to give feedback to someone, you want to make sure that they're in a position where they're willing to receive that feedback. So whether that is you asking someone if they would like to receive feedback, I think that's probably a good idea, is if you see something, an opportunity where you could give feedback to someone, there's nothing wrong with asking them, hey, I'm just thinking about something, would you like to receive some feedback? Most of the time people will say yes, and then you can gauge whether or not they would be ready to receive it. You'll certainly know when you experience the reaction. So if it's a really negative reaction of defensiveness, then just stop there. But if they're willing to take it on, then that's a good thing, as long as you're doing it in love, right? And the Bible talks about that, about speaking truth in love. It's important to do both of those, because that's what giving feedback is about. It's about speaking truth in love. You're speaking truth to someone, but you're doing it in a way. Well, you're doing it because you love them, and you're doing it out of love. You're not doing it out of correction or out of judgment. You're not doing it out of judgment, but you're doing it out of love, and that's speaking the truth. So we need to do that. But I guess with this one, I'm mainly talking about if somebody asks you for feedback, because this can be quite prevalent sometimes. You have people who would ask you for feedback about things, but what they're really asking is validation. They're not asking for feedback in terms of making themselves, growing in themselves or being better, but more so they're asking you for validation. What do I mean by that? You might have a situation that's happened where someone has had a conflict with somebody else, and they've behaved in a certain way, and something's happened, and they come to you for feedback, right? And so they say, how did I behave in that situation? How was it in that situation? And if it's not honest, what happens is some people can do this with the intention of wanting to be validated, and so they expect you to agree with them. They expect you not to say anything negative and not to tell them necessarily the truth, but to side with them and to validate them and to agree with them. And then the minute that you don't agree with them, they become unbelievably defensive, right? And they spend the next 10 minutes lecturing to you why you're wrong. And if that happens, don't bother giving them any more feedback, because whoever is doing that, they're not self-aware. They're doing it out of a state of self-consciousness where they're just wanting validation. And it's not the time and place to give it in that sense. So if that's the case, yeah, you don't want to give feedback to people who are not self-aware. They need to be in a position where they, like we talked about the 3 virtues, where they're humble, where they're vulnerable, and where they're honest, and they're able to receive that feedback. And if they're doing it from a state of self-consciousness, in other words, from a state of fear, from a state of shame, they're not going to be willing to receive it. So that's just a little short stint about giving feedback. But okay, coming back to receiving feedback, because we want to talk about us in terms of self-awareness. So coming back to receiving feedback, something to think about would be, when it comes to feedback, less is more. Don't be fooled into thinking that the more feedback you receive, the better, because it's not necessarily the case. When it comes to feedback, it's not about the quantity of feedback you receive, but rather the quality of feedback that you receive. And so then the question will be, well, how do I ensure that I'm always receiving good quality feedback? Great question. I think there are probably certain people you want to go to, and then certain people you want to avoid when it comes to receiving feedback. And you can recognize this just through simple observation. So I want to start with the people you should avoid when you are wanting to receive feedback. And Paul Scanlon talks about this really, really well. He talks about 2 kinds of people that you want to avoid when receiving feedback. And they are harsh critics and nice friends. You want to avoid harsh critics and nice friends. Harsh critics will always point the finger. They'll always be judging. And they'll find every opportunity that they can to critique you. And it'll be absolutely brutal. Your ego won't be able to handle that. It's where they just, you give them the opportunity and they just let fly, like I mentioned before. They take every opportunity they can to just throw everything that they can into your face in terms of feedback. You want to avoid those people because it's too much. It's too harsh. And even if you did get feedback from those people, the nuggets will be small, in a whole bunch of just noise that you really don't need to hear. So you want to avoid harsh critics. But at the same time, you want to avoid nice friends as well. So nice friends, they can be just as damaging because they're people who will withhold the truth from you in order to keep them liking you, to keep them being your friend, for example. So you might come to someone asking them for honest feedback, and they might be a good friend, and they know the truth, but they withhold it because they don't want to lose peace with you. And if you're only getting feedback from those people, then you're never learning, are you? You're never being exposed to your blind spots. You're never being exposed to what you need to change in your life. So you must avoid harsh critics and nice friends when it comes to receiving feedback. Okay? So then the question is, well, who do you want to receive feedback from? And I think it depends. I think in some situations you want to go to people who know you well. Could be family members, could be friends, could be a pastor, could be people who know you well with some situations, and it's good to do that. To have context. But there will definitely be situations in your life where you need to receive feedback from someone or advice from someone who doesn't know you well at all, and can view the situation from an objective perspective. This is why I rate counselors so highly. I think counseling is just an amazing thing, and I would encourage anyone and everyone to go to counseling because you can learn so much about yourself with someone who has the credentials to be able to articulate and explain how you were feeling, what you were thinking. But I think one of the biggest things about a counselor is that they don't run any risk of ruining a relationship with you because there is no friendship there. You don't even know the person. So they're more than willing to be able to tell you the truth, but because they're qualified as well, they're able to do it in a way that's not going to be too overwhelming, that'll break your spirit. So sometimes when it comes to receiving feedback, who do you receive it from? It's about gauging it's situational. Sometimes it's good to get feedback from a friend or from someone who you know will tell the truth. But when it comes to something more serious, where it could break a friendship, or I'm not sure, or you just need an objective point of view, then it's a good idea to go to a counselor and talk to someone like that. So, I think that's probably the end of our self-awareness journey. This has been really exciting, and I hope that you've been really encouraged by this. It's just as a conclusion, I suppose I would say, when it comes to self-awareness, well, perhaps let's go through a quick recap, right? So internal self-awareness, we've probably heard this enough now, but internal self-awareness is about understanding why you are the way that you are, your thoughts, your habits, and your behaviors, and where they come from, the belief system that those habits and behaviors come from. External self-awareness is about understanding yourself from the perspective of somebody else and how your behaviors are impacting your relationships around you. Okay? Self-consciousness is rooted in the ego, rooted in fear and shame, and it tries to predict a false identity that you have of yourself. And so we talked about self-consciousness and how we need to let go of self-consciousness. And then lastly, feedback, about receiving feedback, receiving information and data that let us know where the blind spots are in our lives. And so just in conclusion, with self-awareness, it's a long journey. It's a lifelong commitment that we need to do. It is something that we will never arrive, and because of that, I would encourage you to not be hard on yourself. I'd encourage you to practice self-compassion, to take your time, and to be patient as well, because it is something that is going to hurt. It's going to be hard because you're facing truths that you don't want to face. You're confronting yourself. You're confronting other people. And it may take a little bit of a toll, but it'll absolutely be more than worth it in the long run, to understand yourself, to understand exactly who you are, the truth of who you are, as well as to understand the truth of how your behaviors are impacting on those around you. And the reward from that is that you can enjoy long-lasting, meaningful relationships with people, because that's what self-awareness is about. It's about maximizing the relationships that you have around you. And the best way that you can do that is through self-awareness. So thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you have enjoyed this series. It's been a blast, and you know what? Enjoy it. Self-awareness, enjoy it. It's a crazy adventure of highs and lows, but in the long run, it'll bring you long-lasting life. So thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time.